So your book doesn't have this information, but it is good information for you to have. This is going to connect some of the dots for when we start to get into the book. It's going to help make life easier. So we're going to cover a little bit about the history of electrotherapeutics. This is not something that they started in the 20th century. We'll trace this all the way back, and then we'll go through basics of electricity. Unless you were an electrician in your former earlier life before you got into PTA school, some of you may have been. Somebody wired a house. Not a wire house. It's I don't know. I don't either. So you make a wire house, man. You're incredible. No, you can wire a stereo system is about as close I'm going to get you, and even that you may not want to use it long. So we'll talk about electricity, some of the basics. Go through of what we actually do during E-STEM. 99.9% of what we do is stimulating nerves. We do not, or very rarely do we actually try to stimulate a muscle. So even though it affects muscle, we are stimulating nerves. What we do is nerve stimulation. Okay, then we'll start getting you through how to cause nerves to actually stimulate to get to the effect we want in the area of the body we want. We have to depolarize a nerve. We got to cause that nerve to move from where it is to where it needs to be. Okay, so let's go through the history. So E-STEM has been something that's been used since about 400 BC with a fellow by the name of Hippocrates. We talked about Hippocrates back in Fundamental Concepts back in the fall of last year. Nobody remembers that but me and Jesus. One person remembers Hippocrates, my God. Hippocratic Oath, we talked about that. Hippocrates was actually using E-STEM back in 400 BC. Instead of using devices like we're going to use here, he used eels or torpedo fish to stimulate people, and he was treating stuff like headaches and all kind of crazy stuff. So Hippocrates is really the father of electrical stimulation way back in the day. I don't think I would want you putting that type of fish. This is a real torpedo fish, in case you were wondering. So you would lay that fish on someone, and the fish, when it was irritated, would shock them. Whoa. It's pretty cool. So in case somebody wants to try that, that's between you and the Lord. I'm not signing off on that. So that's where this starts back. And it dates all the way up. We didn't start therapeutically really diving into electrical stimulation to about the 1960s, 1970s. And it became pervasive from there and has developed even further. So about the 1960s is where the United States picked it up and then has gone from there. Okay, so what is electrical current? How does electricity work? Whether this is your house or whether this with your phones or whatever you have, electricity works the same no matter where it's being done. Electricity is simply the flow of an electrical current. So you have to have current flow to have electricity. So that's why you have power lines and substations. Their job is to carry electrical current from a power source and then transmit that source into something usable. So we flow electrical current to form electricity. So without the flow of electrical current, there is no electricity. If you've ever been in a house and it's bad weather and your power pops off, they've interrupted the flow of electrical current. You can't go there and go, let me turn my light on to make sure it works or not. You don't know. There's no electrical current flowing. So electrical current is simply the flow of charged particles. It's dealing with electron flow as it relates to charged particles inside an atom. We're not going that deep into it, but just know it's electron flow inside of charged particles. So that's what's that's electrical current, is electron flow inside of charged particles. So it jumps from area to area. All current will flow as long as a particle, there's a difference in particle, and there's two terminals or poles for them to flow. So when you're looking at a battery, it's going to have a positive pole and a positive pole and a negative pole. If you're looking at something that's AC powered, the two prongs are going to be the same way, just like you're using a positive and a negative pole on a battery. So that's why the prongs are built the way they're built. You ever try to plug in something that doesn't have both prongs? It's not going to work. So you have to have the prongs. They operate the exact same as terminals. So when you plug them in, they're going to start the flow of electrons or electrical current, the flow of charged particles. When we look at how current flows, especially dealing with items we use, current is going to flow from positive to negative. So it's going to leave the positive pole and travel toward the negative pole. So current flows positive to negative. Electron flow is actually going to go the opposite way, though. It's going to go from negative to positive. And that'll be important once we get to iontophoresis. How do electrons flow? But for right now, current flows positive to negative. Okay, positive to negative. We're going from the positive pole to the negative pole. All right, in nature, there are two different types of currents that we use every day and that we use no matter what. We can either use direct current or we can use alternating current. Direct current is going to be used as something like batteries. So the battery in your cell phone, the battery in your car, the batteries in your remote control, the battery in this remote control, those are going to be direct current structures. And it's going to have unidirectional, uninterrupted flow. So direct current, unidirectional, uninterrupted flow. Meaning once it's plugged up, power is always available. That's the hope. Nothing worse than jumping into a car and you find out that power is not available and your battery is dead. Like, freaking battery. So uninterrupted. As long as it's plugged up, there's power available. Whereas we also have alternating current, that's going to be things that we plug in. So anything you plug in, a receptacle, wall plugs. I'm sure you plugged in something this morning, your blender or I don't know, your cell phone, your DC battery was charging via an AC wall charger. You plugged your cell phone in and took it off the charger. So we charge it using an AC format. Your computers usually are plugged into an AC. They're plugged into the wall somewhere. So AC current, alternating current. And this is still, instead of it being unidirectional, it's bidirectional continuous flow of electrical current. And we'll tell you what unidirectional and bidirectional is once it's relevant. Right now, just no uni or bidirectional. I promise you before today is over, you'll understand the difference. Okay, so in nature, we only use direct current or alternating current. stuff that we use is either direct current or alternating current. So even in a Tesla, you're like, man, I drive a Tesla. It's still a DC. All you're doing is charging the battery. You plug it in. You use an AC charger to plug into the car to charge a DC battery, and the car drives off a battery instead of gas. So it doesn't matter. Whatever you're thinking, a lot of times it's either DC or AC. So we can do stuff like solar power and get way off into the weeds, but for right now, DC or AC. Okay, E-stem machines can either be DC or AC type machines. You're going to learn on both. I actually preference DC machines over AC machines. Now, you'll have your preference. Everybody else likes AC machines. Y'all like the big fancy stuff that plugs up into the wall. That's cool. Everybody likes those. The reason I don't like those as much is you don't have as much control to set things with an AC machine as you do with the DC machine. So once you learn how to do it, it doesn't matter which machine you're using it on. But I do like DC machines to start off with learning. So ACs will have to be plugged into the wall like the ultrasound units y'all were using or the laser like y'all were using, whereas DC machines are going to be portable. They'll be handheld. We'll show you some of those. We have two different types of three types of DC units that we use in this class so that you will learn. Relating to E-stem uses the two types of current that we talked about that's available in nature, but it adds a different one. It adds something called pulsed current. Pulsed current. Pulsed current is only found relating to the use of electrical stimulation. Nothing else in nature uses pulsed current. So the only place we find pulsatile current is with the use of E-stem. So different types are used for different things. We'll get to what those mean. Don't try to remember all the words right now. Just know electrical stem machines either use a DC current, an AC current, or a pulsed current. All machines use one of the three. If it's going to be E-stem, it's going to either be DC, AC, or pulsed. Let's do this. Let's go to the next slide, then we'll come back. How does electrical stimulation works? It works by stimulating either cutaneous or sensory nerves. So that's what we just talked about today. Your dermatomes deal with your sensory nerves, your abilities to sense. That's why you just did the dermatome assessment. You were able to sense if someone was talking, was touching you. So that's a sensory nerve. So it's either going to stimulate a sensory nerve, it's either going to stimulate a motor nerve. So we're trying to get muscle contraction, so we're trying to stimulate a motor nerve. Or in very rare cases, we are stimulating a muscle directly, and that's called de-innervated muscle. We're stimulating a muscle that does not have nerve innervation going to it. It loses this loop right here. Somewhere this connection is lost, and we're not getting motor information from the brain to the muscle. So sometimes we will stimulate de-innervated muscle so that we can sometimes we're trying to get muscle pumping so that we can get return of blood flow back to the body. Sometimes we're trying to get movement out of a muscle so that a person can end up getting more blood flow, getting more flexibility, things like that, so that they don't stiffen up. So sometimes we will do de-innervated muscle stimulation, but 99% of the time when we're doing E-stim to a person, we're stimulating either a sensory nerve or a motor nerve. Very rarely do we stimulate an actual de-innervated muscle. We'll show you. I think I have some videos of times when we do it. Okay. So it says, regarding the body, muscles and nerve cells communicate through electrical current already. Current is how your body communicates right now. So current runs from your brain down your spinal cord and out. Current runs from your sensory system into your spinal cord and then processes where it needs to go. So electrical current is your body's current way of communicating. It likes it. So all we're doing is just building off of what the body likes to do. Okay. Says normal E-stim stimulates intact nerves. That's a big thing. Intact nerves that are not dysfunctional. We stimulate intact nerves. When muscles are not contracting, nerves are said to be at rest. So when you're not moving, your nerves and your muscles are at rest. When you move, then you have activity. Activity happens when a nerve cell has information relayed from the brain to it, and then it causes movement of the muscle we want to move. And the way we do it is we have to move the nerve cell from rest to a place where it's functioning. So nerve cells have to go from rest to functioning. That's a big thing that we do. We move nerve cells from rest to function. So that's the whole goal of E-stim, is to move a nerve cell from rest to function. So, and that's not just with E-stim, that's any movement that we do. If you're moving on your own, that happens because we move a nerve cell from rest to activity. Moving the nerve cell from rest to activity. The technical term for what we're doing is called depolarizing a nerve cell. That's what we're doing there. That's what we're doing. Moving a nerve cell from rest to activity is called depolarizing a nerve cell. So if we want the nerve to function, we have to depolarize it. Okay. Let's see here. Yeah. It's just showing you all the different nerve cells in the body. These are all the sensory nerves. We talked a little bit about that. We'll go into deeper detail on the sensory nerves themselves. So we talked about cutaneous. Well, these are more cutaneous nerve. Well, sensory, we'll call them sensory nerves. Nerves that have sensory function. So that's what we're seeing there. Nerves with sensory function. So we've gone through dermatomes, area of skin where sensory function works. And then we'll eventually talk about actual cutaneous nerves or sensory nerves, nerves that have sensory function. And then these are the motor nerves of the body, the different plexes or the different motor nerves that can be stimulated to cause motor nerve depolarization. Okay, so nerves, again, when they're not causing movement of muscles, so this This is whether we're dealing with motor, moving muscle, or sensory. When a nerve is not being stimulated, it is said to be at rest. So let's watch this. I think this will be relevant to get you to understand nerves at rest and then how we move them into action. Oh, Lord. No, we're not watching the whole thing. We'll watch some of it.
This is a neuron, which has four main parts. The dendrites receive information. The cell body processes and integrates that information. This is a neuron.
Yeah, here we go.
This is a neuron, which has four main parts. The dendrites receive information. The cell body processes and integrates that information. The axon carries the information along long distances from one part of the neuron to another, and the axon terminal transmits the information to the next cell in the chain. A bundle of axons traveling together is called a nerve. Nerves can be very long, as they often need to transmit information over long distances. As we just saw, the dendrites are the part of the neuron that receives incoming signals. Based on the strength of this incoming stimulation, the neuron must decide whether to pass that signal along or not. If the stimulation is strong enough, the signal is transmitted along the entire length of the axon in a phenomenon called an action potential. When this happens, we say the neuron fires. Transmission of a neuronal signal is entirely dependent on the movement of ions or charged particles. Various ions, including sodium, potassium, and chloride, are unequally distributed between the inside and the outside of the cell. The presence and movement of these ions is not only important when a neuron fires, but also at rest. To start, let's think about the positively charged sodium and potassium ions. When a neuron is not sending a signal, it is considered to be at rest. In a typical neuron, in its resting state, the concentration of sodium ions is higher outside the cell than inside. The relative concentration of potassium ions is the opposite, with more ions inside the cell than outside. This ionic separation occurs right at the cell membrane and creates a chemical gradient across the membrane. Because ions are charged particles, we also need to consider their charge when thinking about their distribution across the membrane. At rest, there are more positively charged ions outside the cell relative to the inside. This creates a difference in charge across the membrane, which is called an electrical gradient. Together with the chemical gradient we already mentioned, we refer to this ionic imbalance as the electrochemical gradient. The difference in total charge inside and outside of the cell is called the membrane potential. At rest, when no signals are being transmitted, a neuronal membrane has a resting potential of approximately -70 millivolts. This means that the inside of the cell is approximately 70 millivolts less positive than the outside. Both the chemical and electrical gradients we just discussed contribute to establishing this potential. While the inside of the cell has a net negative charge and the outside of the cell has a net positive charge, the charges line up at the membrane and the bulk solution on either side is actually electrically neutral. The resting membrane potential is the point where the cell has achieved electrochemical equilibrium. This means that the concentration gradient and the electrical gradient for each ion is equal and opposite. Ions cannot simply move across the membrane at will. Instead, they need a protein embedded in the membrane to facilitate their movement. Most ions cross the membrane through a structure called an ion channel. ions move through channels by passive diffusion along their concentration gradient. Some ion channels are always open, but many require a signal to tell them to open or close. For example, voltage-gated channels only open when the membrane potential reaches a certain value. On the other hand, ligand-gated ion channels are triggered to open when they are bound by a specific molecule. Mechanically gated ion channels open in response to physical forces such as changes in length or changes in pressure. Most ion channels are selectively permeable, meaning that they only allow one or a small subset of ions to pass through. Voltage-gated ion channels, for example, typically only allow a single ion to cross the membrane when they. As ions move through a channel and cross from one side of the cell membrane to the other, they cause the membrane potential of the cell to move away from its resting potential. If the resulting change in membrane potential is small, we call this a graded potential. Graded potentials can vary in size, can be either positive or negative, are transient, and typically do not result from the opening of voltage-gated ion channels. When ion channels open and a graded potential occurs, the neuron moves quickly to reset its membrane potential to resting values. This is accomplished primarily by the use of the sodium-potassium pump, which uses the energy generated by ATP hydrolysis to actively transport ions across the membrane against their concentration gradient. In other words, sodium is transported to the outside of the cell, where its concentration is higher, and potassium is transported back into the cell, where its concentration is higher. One cycle of this pump transports 3 sodium ions outside the cell and brings 2 potassium ions inside the cell. This unbalanced charge transfer contributes to the separation of charge across the membrane and also to the ionic concentrations we see at rest, thus restoring the chemical and electrical gradients to their resting levels. Maintaining these ionic balance in neurons is so important that this process can account for 20 to 40% of the brain's total energy use. Only when the resting membrane potential and ion sodium channel is closed. Once the cell membrane reaches the threshold voltage, the channel changes to an open position, and sodium rushes into the cell because of the electrochemical gradient. As positive sodium ions enter the cell, the membrane potential becomes less negative and more positive as it approaches 0 millivolts. This is called depolarization. Eventually, the voltage gradient goes to 0 and beyond 0, up to a positive 30 millivolts. This is called an overshoot. As the membrane potential becomes positive, the sodium channel inactivation gate shuts, making the channel inactivated. This stops the flow of sodium ions into the cell. The change in membrane potential also opens the voltage-gated potassium channels, though they open and close more slowly. Because of the potassium electrochemical gradient, potassium ions flow out of the cell, making it less positive and eventually negative. This process is called repolarization. Because the potassium channels are a little slow to close, for a brief period the membrane potential is hyperpolarized. It's more negative than the resting potential. During hyperpolarization, the potassium channels close. Throughout all this, the sodium-potassium pump is still working. The pump restores the chemical gradients by putting the sodium and potassium back in place. And the pump reestablishes the potential gradient by moving more sodium ions out than potassium ions in. This returns the membrane potential back to its resting potential. During repolarization, the inactivated sodium channels won't respond to any stimulus at all. During this time, the neuron is in its absolute refractory period, the period of time when a nerve cannot fire another action potential no matter how strongly it's stimulated. The absolute refractory period prevents action potentials from happening again too quickly and prevents the action potential from traveling backwards along the axon. During hyperpolarization, the sodium channels are closed and the inactivation gate opens. There is no change in sodium flow, but now they could be opened again. This is called the relative refractory period because, while the sodium channels could open, it would take a larger than usual stimulus to reach threshold because the cell is hyperpolarized due to the potassium still leaving the cell. The amplitude
kind of monotone, but she's really good. Information is great. So let's delve into what she was saying. Essentially, what the nice lady just described is the fact that at rest, nerves are not depolarized. So a nerve at rest is not depolarized, it's resting. So just like you, when you're laying on your couch with your feet up on the sofa, no one's bothering you, you say, I am resting. Or whatever you do for rest. I don't know what everybody does for rest. You may not like sitting on a couch, I don't know. But whatever you do for rest, that's rest. So at rest, there's very limited movement, there's nothing going on. With nerves, nerves have a measurement of rest. So we can't measure rest in a human being per se. I don't know if you're resting or not. Some people think not moving is resting. Some folks feel like fishing is resting. Some folks feel like jogging is resting. I don't know. Everybody has their idea of resting. We can't measure that in humans, but we can measure that in cells. In your cells, your nerve cells have a number that identifies when they are at rest. And that number is minus 70 millivolts. Minus 70 millivolts. That, if we stuck a probe in there, an electrical probe inside of your nerves, which we can do, that is, we'll talk about what that's called later, but we can stick an electrical probe in your nerve and measure the electrical potential going on inside of your nerve. People get it done every day. And we'll talk about what branch of science that's called, and you'll even get to see one. I have a video of someone getting one done. But we can stick a probe in your nerve and measure your resting membrane potential or whatever is happening going on in there. Resting membrane potential is maintained. Let's do that. It's maintained by what we would call our sodium potassium ion concentration. Sodium potassium ion concentration. Sodium is Na, potassium is K, NaK, ion, sodium ion, gate. We just call it a gate. So, inside of your nerve cell, so this will be your nerve cell. So this is inside, we'll draw I, this is outside, that's an O. In a nerve cell, you're going to have a whole lot of potassium on the inside. You'll have a lot of K's on the inside. Looks like a good pitcher at the end of 9 innings. You'll get that joke later. There you go. It's over to somebody's head. We'll get it. All right, so a lot of potassium on the inside. On the outside of the cell, we have tons of sodium. Sodium is everywhere. Sodium is everywhere. Sodium is everywhere. Okay, so at rest, these have a normal concentration level. But let's say I don't need to be at rest. I need to move. I need my body to move. So what I need to do is I need to change this structure and function, and I need to now start communicating motor information or sensory information from a part of my body to those nerves so that they can cause an effect of what I want. So we'll just use motor because it's easier to think about it with motor. So I need to move. So I'm laying on my couch, my feet are down. I get a sensation. I have to go to the potty. I got to go urinate. So you got to go potty. All right. So you're not going to lay down on the couch and pee on yourself. I pray not. Please, nobody do that. Okay. Nobody's face looks weird. Thank God. Nobody does that. All right. So you get a sensation. You need to go to the restroom. So you need to move. It's coming. I got to go to the restroom. I got to move. So now we need to change from a resting potential to a movement potential. We need to start getting motor information to our legs to tell them to get up and walk us to the restroom. We got to get that information there. How do we do that? We need to do that by depolarizing our motor nerve cell in our legs. Okay, so how do we depolarize, or how do we overcome resting membrane potential? So what we need first is something called an action potential. So the first thing we need is an action potential. An action potential is like an electrical shock. That moves the body from rest to action. Now that can come from my brain. Most of it comes from your brain when we're dealing with motor nerves. Your CNS sends the action potential down the nerve to tell your PNS to then operate your legs. Okay. So, the information, the action potential information is received from your CNS. It then goes to your dendrites, which will be on the other side of this. Your dendrites pick that up. Woo, we need to get moving. And now they start to send information to the cell body, and that sends it down the nerve so that the nerve can then depolarize or can cause movement of the body or the motor part of the body. So we need to depolarize it. Okay, so how do we do that? So again, the action potential is the first set. So once I have an action potential, what happens? The action potential forces number two. Oh, shoot. The action potential forces sodium into the cell and potassium out of the cell. So the action potential is causing a chain reaction. It's forcing sodium in, and it's kicking potassium out. As it's doing this, it's going to start to move the actual, it's going to start to move the actual resting membrane potential that we measure. So let's go to this slide. So it's going to start to move the resting membrane potential that we measure. Remember, we said we can get a probe in there and we can measure resting membrane potential. We can get a probe in and we can measure what happens during an action potential. So I can have an action potential that does one or two things. My action potential can either meet the threshold for full depolarization, meaning it's going to cause this whole chain reaction all the way through, or it cannot meet the threshold for full depolarization. If it's not meeting the threshold, it's called a subthreshold stimulus. This is when there is some level of information, but it doesn't lead to full action. Subthreshold stimulation. But once I reach my threshold level, then I'm going to fully depolarize that nerve cell. The threshold level is at minus 55 millivolts. So as sodium rushes in, it's going to make my nerve cell more positive. So let's show you that. So when we're looking at a nerve cell, sodium positive ions are on the outside. Potassium, which is positive as well, but it's less positive than this, so it's more negative, is going to be inside. When I start to rush the outside in, I'm going to make my cell more positive. I'm going to move it from minus 70, the book says minus 65, but it's minus 70, up to a positive number. So depolarization moves me from minus 70 to minus 60 to minus 50 to minus 40. So I'm going more positive. I'm rushing positive ions in, and it's making my cell more positive. Once I get to minus 55, now I set off the entire depolarization structure. So it's going to now move down all of my nerves that's connected to that part of the body, and it's going to tell it to all move together. So minus 55 is my threshold point for an action potential to cause full nerve depolarization. This is where information says it's just going from it's going from a slight bit of information to a full-blown need. I'm depolarized. Now it needs to fully go. So minus 55 is that number for depolarization. Okay. All right. Okay. Stimulus action potentials that cause this are going to be all or none. So it doesn't matter. The intensity can change, but once it meets threshold, it meets threshold. And it's going to cause for depolarization. Okay. Okay. So what happens once I now depolarize? I go from needing to depolarize to full depolarization. Now what's going to happen is I'm going to keep rushing sodium into the cell and depolarize it even further. So my threshold level, these are sub-thresholds, these short blue lines here. So these are failed action potentials. So they're sub-threshold, the little blue lines right here. But once I reach a full action potential, I get enough sodium into the cell to now turn the cell a minus 55. I'm now in full depolarization. I'm rushing all of that information down that nerve cell. And it's going to depolarize my nerve until I get to a positive 30. So it's going to cause depolarization till I get to a positive 30. So I rush that much sodium in. It's trying to get some type of signaling to me that much. I'm rushing sodium in till I get from minus 70 to minus 55 to a positive 30. At a positive 30, that sends another signal to tell the sodium potassium channels it's time to close and reverse this thing. We need to reset. So positive 30 is my key to reset this process. And it leads to what we would call repolarization. So now repolarizing, I'm going back to the normal state. I'm pushing all of the sodium out. I'm bringing all of the potassium back in. I'm going to repolarize. Well, during repolarization, what happens is we push so much potassium in and so much sodium out that we go below threshold. And now once we go below threshold, that sends another signal to the cell to say we need to then, readjust and get back to resting potential at minus 70. So information is flooding in. It's helping me to understand how I can depolarize a nerve cell. No communication happens in the brain without depolarizing a nerve cell. All the brain or all the connection or all the communication between our brain and our spinal cord and our peripheral nerves happens through electrical communication. And we have to depolarize the nerve so that it can cause this to happen. Right. Action potential is what raises resting membrane potential. So I need an action potential, or think of an action potential as a trigger. Its job is to start the process of depolarizing the nerve. Yeah, so the nerve is going to stay at rest until some type of action potential or trigger happens to cause it to now depolarize. So I need the action potential. Let me see here. Okay. Let me see if this is the one I want. Hang on just a second. Doug.
Looks like we've told people Liberty Mutual customizes your car insurance so you only pay for what you need.
Okay.
Nerve impulses, also known as action potentials, travel from the brain or spinal cord to trigger the contraction of skeletal muscles. An action potential propagates down a motor neuron to a skeletal muscle fiber. The site where a motor neuron excites a skeletal muscle fiber is called the neuromuscular junction. This junction is a chemical synapse consisting of the points of contact between the axon terminals of a motor neuron and the motor end plate of a skeletal muscle fiber. The events at the neuromuscular junction occur in 7 coordinated steps. Step 1. An action potential travels the length of the axon of a motor neuron to an axon terminal. Step 2. Voltage-gated calcium channels open and calcium ions diffuse into the terminal.
Okay, so that's more motor end plate. It's good information, but that's not where I want y'all. I think this is the one I want. But that was a good video showing you the action potential. Nope, that's still my lady. No, that's not the one I want either. That's the wrong one too. There's a really good one. Okay.
What if everything you did, thought, and felt could be communicated by pushing a button? It'd be like using the world's simplest app, one that just sends out a little ping, always at the same volume and length, to communicate everything from "it sure is cold in here" to "I love churros" to "boy, I sure would like to breathe sometime soon." Well, that is actually exactly how your neurons send all the impulses responsible for every one of your actions, thoughts, and emotions. When a neuron is stimulated enough, it fires an electrical impulse that zips down its axon to its neighboring neurons. But they've only got one signal that they can send, and it only transmits at one uniform strength and speed. What they can vary is the frequency or number of pulses, like this is distinct from this. And your brain can translate these signals, reading them like binary code, organizing them by location, sensation, magnitude, and importance, so that you know the difference between "turn up the thermostat" and "oh my gosh, I'm on fire." That buzz, that nerve impulse, is called the action potential. It's one of the most fundamental aspects of anatomy and physiology, and really life in general. It's happening inside of you right now, and we want to make sure that you understand what all that buzz is about. Before we delve into how neurons communicate, we gotta first understand a little bit of our old friend electricity. Basically, think of your body as a sack of batteries. No, I mean, you don't look like a sack of batteries. I'm just saying that your body as a whole is electrically neutral with equal amounts of positive and negative charges floating around, but certain areas are more positively or negatively charged than others. And because opposite charges attract, we need barriers or membranes to keep positive and negative charges separate until we're ready to use the energy that their attraction creates. In other words, we keep them separated to build potential. A battery, just sitting on its own, has both a positive and a negative end, and the potential to release energy, but it doesn't do anything until it's hooked up to a flashlight or a phone or a kid's toy that lets those charges move toward each other, on the way converting electricity into light or sound or children's laughter. In much the same way, each neuron in your body is like its own little battery with its own separated charges. It just needs an event to trigger the action that brings those charges together. If you're thinking that this sounds more like engineering than anatomy, that might not be a bad thing. It might even help to think of your neurons in the same terms an electrician might use. Voltage, for example, is the measure of potential energy generated by separated charges. It's Electricity 101 down? Let's see how it works inside your nervous system. A resting neuron is like a battery just sitting in that sack that is you. When it's just sitting there, it's more negative on the inside of the cell relative to the extracellular space around it. The difference is known as the neuron's resting membrane potential, and it sits at around negative 70 millivolts. Where do those charges come from? Outside of a resting neuron, there's a bunch of positive sodium ions floating around, just lingering outside the membrane. Inside, the neuron holds potassium ions that are positive as well, cell, but they're mingled with bigger negatively charged proteins. And since there are more sodium ions outside than there are potassium ions inside, the cell's interior has an overall negative charge. When a neuron has a negative membrane potential like this, it is said to be polarized. Now, these ions didn't just show up in this arrangement on their own. This is all orchestrated by one of the most important bits of machinery in your nervous system, the sodium-potassium pump. This little protein straddles the membrane of the neuron, and there are tons of them all along the axon. For every 2 potassium ions it pumps into the cell, it pumps out 3 sodium ions. This creates a difference in the concentration of sodium and potassium, and a difference in charges, making it more positive open. It all starts with your neuron sitting there at resting state. All of the ion channels are closed and the inner voltage is resting at negative 70 millivolts. And then something happens. Some environmental stimulus occurs, say like a spider brushes up against a tiny hair on your knee, triggering those sodium channels to open, increasing the charge inside the membrane. Now the stimulus and the resulting change have to be strong enough to cross a threshold for the true action potential to kick in, and that threshold is about negative 55 millivolts. Remember that number, because this is an all or nothing phenomenon. If the stimulus is too weak and the change doesn't hit that level, it's like a false alarm. The neuron just returns to its resting state. But kind of like Doc Brown hitting 1.21 gigawatts in the DeLorean, once it hits that threshold, you're not going to travel in time, but you are going to see some serious action potential. At that threshold, the voltage-gated sodium channels open, and there are tons of these, so all of the positive sodium ions rush in, making the cell massively depolarized. So much so that it actually goes positive, up to about positive 40 millivolts. This is action potential in action. It's really just a temporary reversal of a membrane potential, a brief depolarization caused by changes in currents. And unlike graded potentials, which are small and localized, an action potential kicks off a biological chain reaction which sends that electrical signal down the axon. Because each of your neurons has lots of voltage-gated sodium channels, so when a few in one area open, that local current is strong enough to change the voltage around them. And that triggers their neighbors, which triggers the voltage around them, and so on down the line. As soon as all that's underway, the process of repolarization kicks in. This time the voltage-gated potassium ion channels open up, letting those potassium ions flow out in an attempt to rebalance the charges. If anything, it goes too far at first, and the membrane briefly goes through hyperpolarization. Its voltage drops to negative 75 or so millivolts before all of the gates close and the sodium-potassium pumps take over and bring things back to their resting level. Now, when part of an axon is in the middle of all this and its ion channels are open, it can't respond to any other stimulus, no matter how strong. This is called the refractory period, and it's there to help prevent signals from traveling in both directions down the axon at once. So that
That's what's happening. That's how we get information from our brain, because remember, we're dealing with motor. So it's going from the brain now down the body so that we can cause something to happen. We use the exampling of, like, I need to go to the restroom. So I have to get up and go. I need to signal to my legs it's time to stand up and move. So I need an action potential that causes me to do that, to stand and move. So it has to get me from minus 70 millivolts all the way up to minus 55. So the action, so let's see here. So I'm at minus 70 rest. Next, I have an action potential that hits, and now it moves me from minus 70 to minus 55 millivolts, and then that takes me all the way up to positive 30. And during this phase here, I am depolarizing all of the motor nerves needed for movement. So I'm telling all of the nerves that will interact with the muscles that I need, it's time to move. This is what that's telling them, move. Okay? Then they get to a place, once they have been depolarized to their highest state, where they need to now repolarize. And it's going to move me from positive 30 all the way back down to like a minus 90 millivolts. And that minus 90 is called hyperpolarization. And then I have to move from that minus 90 back up to minus 70 to get back to resting membrane potential. So I'm having to depolarize, repolarize, hyperpolarize, and then back to resting membrane. So you definitely want to know the numbers that are associated with it. All these numbers are really important. And then you want to know the names of what's happening based on the numbers we're using. Resting membrane potential, a nerve at rest is minus 70. Threshold for full depolarization is minus 55. Full depolarization is positive 30. Repolarization is from positive 30 down to, it should stop at minus 70, but it doesn't. It hyperpolarizes and then goes down to goes down to negative 90. And now I have to readjust and go back to resting membrane at positive 70. At negative 70. And this whole thing is done by either pushing sodium out of the cell or pushing sodium into the cell. Pushing potassium out of the cell or bringing potassium back into the cell. Okay. So that's what's happening every time I need to communicate motor information to my body. No matter what movement you're doing, just simply bending your elbows or moving your fingers to right or turning your head to see what's going on or rolling your eyes because you're like, this is the boringest crap I've ever done. Whatever you're doing, it's still controlled by something motor. You're doing this process no matter what you're doing, as long as you're not at rest. Okay, so during these periods, one or two things can happen. I can be in what's called an absolute refractory period, or I can be in a relative refractory period. Okay, so that's where we're headed. I can be in a absolute refractory, or I can be in a relative refractory. Absolute refractory is the time period where a nerve cannot be depolarized by another action potential no matter what. So it gives the nerve a chance to actually return back to some of its resting state. It's found from the period of depolarization to repolarization. So when I'm depolarizing to repolarization, I am an absolute refractory, meaning the nerve cell is already open. Sodium is already rushing in. I can't send another action potential to do what's already being done. It's absolute refractory. That period of time lasts for about 0.4 seconds, 0.4 milliseconds to a full 2 milliseconds. So 0.4 to about 2 milliseconds. Faster than the blink of an eye. So this stuff is happening faster than the blink of an eye. So faster than you can blink, these things are happening in milliseconds. A camera shutter isn't even as fast as this. If you ever take a picture, you hear your camera shutter, shlick, shlick. This is faster than even that. So that's going to allow for my system to not send information either back up the nerve cell or send extra information down it. I need it to go through this process normal. So we have a built-in absolute refractory period. Then we have what's called a relative refractory period from the time of hyperpolarization to returning back to our normal resting membrane. It lasts about 10 milliseconds. During this time, I can send another action potential down the line and can cause depolarization of the nerve cell again. So in case I need to do multiple things, then I'm starting to do that through relative refractory. So absolute versus relative refractory. Let me let the guy, he does a good job of explaining this as well.
That is the surprisingly, it can't respond to any. Now, when part of an axon is in the middle of all this and its ion channels are open, it can't respond to any other stimulus, no matter how strong. This is called the refractory period, and it's there to help prevent signals from traveling in both directions down the axon at once. So that is the surprisingly simple app that your nervous system uses to let you experience the world. And because the voltages in this process are always pretty much the same, the initial threshold around negative 55 millivolts and the peak depolarization at 40 millivolts, your neurons only communicate in a single monotone buzz. It doesn't matter if it's a spider on your knee or an elephant, a paper cut or a stab wound, the strength of that action potential is always the same. What does change is the frequency of the buzz. A weak stimulus tends to trigger less frequent action potentials, and that includes if the stimulus is coming from you, like your brain telling your muscles to perform some task. If I need to do something delicate, like pick up an egg, the signal is low frequency. But a more intense signal, like trying to crush a can, increases the frequency of those action potentials to tell your muscles to contract harder, and the message turns into something that you can't ignore. Action potentials also vary by speed or conduction velocity. They're fastest in pathways that govern things like reflexes, for example, but they're slower in places like your glands, guts, and blood vessels. And the factor that affects a neuron's transmission speed the most is whether there's a myelin sheath on its axon. Axons coated in insulating myelin conduct impulses faster than non-myelinated ones, partly because instead of just triggering one channel at a time in a chain reaction, a current can effectively leap from one gap in the myelin to the next. These little gaps are the delightfully named nodes of Ranvier, and this kind of propagation is known as saltatory conduction, from the Latin word for leaping. But what happens when an action potential...
Yeah, so very good. So that's the goal. That's why we have absolute versus relative refractory. Its goal is to limit the amount of information that is either going out or increasing the amount. So relative refractory means I can get more action potential so that I can make sure that whatever the signal is, it's not ignored. Some you ignore, some you can't. And so your body has a built-in signaling mechanism to let you know which one is happening at which time. So absolute versus relative refractory. Okay, so yeah, we won't worry about that. So that's absolute versus relative refractory. And the speed, as the gentleman said, is going to be determined by if we are using nerves that are coated in myelin or nerves that are not. The ones that have myelin sheathing around them transmit faster, and they're going to reach their destination faster. Ones that are not coated will reach their destination slower. And there are different cell types that operate that have myelin and don't have myelin. And we'll get to those once we get out to that. Okay. So, questions regarding physiology, action potentials, information, resting membrane, different types of current. So we talked about Hippocrates again, how we talked about electrical current itself, how current flows from positive to negative. So that's in your house or in your batteries or whatever. Current always flows positive to negative. but it is the flow of charged particles, and those charged particles are the electrons, and they are going to flow from negative to positive. They flow in the opposite direction. We talked about the two different types, direct current versus alternating current. We talked about the different machines we're going to use. Some are direct current, some are alternating current. We talked about the way the machines use them. So the machines use types of DC or types of AC waves or types of pulsatile currents. So every machine is either going to have some type of either DC, AC, or pulse current. Different machines will have different things. Older machines are going to be strategic from old ideas. Newer machines are going to be strategic from new ideas. This is probably the newest machine. It's newest in design that we have the machine right there. So you're going to find it has a lot more options than any other machine. Some of them you will never use. Some of them you probably will, just depending on where you work. And so your machine, the actual waveforms that the machine will use will be predetermined by the manufacturer. But it's either going to be a type of AC, a type of DC, or a type of pulsatile current. So that's what we're using. We talked about what the objective is: stimulating cutaneous nerves. We're trying to stimulate either cutaneous or sensory nerves so that we can get some type of sensory effect. Usually we're doing that for pain modulation, or we're trying to stimulate a motor nerve so that we can get a muscle contraction. Rarely do we ever stimulate the innervated muscle. At times we will, just depending on the types of system. Then we walk you through how do we depolarize nerves, whether that's a sensory nerve or whether that's a motor nerve. How do we depolarize it? How do we move it from rest to action? So that's the goal. Every time something needs to be done, you're moving a nerve from rest to action. And that's what we talked about. We have to move it from rest, which is something we can measure, minus 70 millivolts. We can measure rest of a nerve. We need to move it from that to action. How do we do that? We need an electrical charge that forces it to do that. It's not just going to do it on its own. That electrical charge is termed an action potential. And the action potential has strengths. It has to be strong enough to move it from rest to a place where it can then fully depolarize. The place that it can move from rest to where it can fully depolarize is called the threshold. And that threshold is set at minus 55. Once it reaches the threshold, that action potential has done its job. Now we're going to transmit that information from that nerve cell all the way down to the resulting muscle. It's going to connect to the neuromuscular junction. It's going to tell the muscle how it wants it to contract. How much force is going to be determined by the number of action potentials. And those are going to be determined by when we send those action potentials. We can't send them during absolute refractory period where there's no stimulation that can happen. It has to be sent during periods of relative refractory so that we can get more information faster. So the more information we get, the faster it goes. That's going to tell us we need to use more force, or we need to move with more urgency, more action. Okay? All right, any questions? Not worried about that yet. We'll get to that. Okay, so that's good information. All righty. All right, we will start lunch a bit early. I don't want your brains to rot. We'll come back around, we'll give you an hour. So we'll call it 10:50. We'll call it 10:55. That'll give you a chance to get to your car. See you back at 11:55.